8,200 years ago, a chunk of the seafloor the size of Iceland gave way, all at once off the coast of Norway. It's called the Storegga Slide, and it remains one of the largest submarine landslides ever discovered. An area of roughly 80,000 square kilometers of sediment, built up over hundreds of thousands of years, simply collapsed and slid down into the deep Atlantic, displacing more than 3,000 cubic kilometers of material in the process. To put that in perspective, that's enough material to bury an area the size of a small country under more than a mile of debris. When that much of the seafloor moves that fast, the ocean above it has nowhere to go but up and out. The result was a megatsunami, a wave so large it left physical evidence hundreds of kilometers from where it started. Evidence geologists can still dig up today in western Norway, the Faroe Islands, northeast Britain, Denmark, and even Greenland. No warning systems, no evacuation routes, no news broadcasts telling coastal communities what was coming. Just an ordinary day, and then the sea itself turning into something no one there had ever seen before. And somewhere directly in its path was a place called Doggerland. If that name is unfamiliar, that's because it hasn't existed in any visible form for thousands of years. Doggerland was a real physical landscape, a wide, low expanse of hills, marshes, and river valleys that once connected what is now Britain to the European mainland. Rising seas at the end of the last ice age were already slowly swallowing it, but for a long stretch of the Mesolithic period, it was solid ground. Hunter-gatherer communities lived there. They fished its rivers, hunted across its plains, and buried their dead in its soil. It was not an empty, forgotten wilderness. It was somebody's home. For a long time, nobody knew any of this had happened at all. The evidence for Storegga wasn't found in a history book or an old story passed down through generations. It was found by accident, buried in the ground itself, by people who weren't even looking for a tsunami. Oil companies surveying the seafloor off Norway in the 1970s, searching for drilling sites, mapped out a massive scarred depression on the ocean floor, and realized they were looking at the aftermath of an enormous ancient landslide. Around the same time, geologists working on dry land hundreds of kilometers away in Scotland kept turning up a strange, distinct layer of sand buried deep in coastal peat bogs, sitting in places sand simply should not be, well inland and well above where any ordinary tide could ever reach. It took years of piecing together evidence from both ends, the scarred seafloor near Norway and the mysterious sand layer in Scotland, before scientists understood they were looking at two halves of the same catastrophe: a landslide on one side of the North Sea and the physical fingerprint of the wave it created, deposited hundreds of kilometers away on the other. And for years, the story told about Doggerland's final chapter was a simple, dramatic one. The Storegga tsunami struck, and in a single catastrophic afternoon, it finished the job that rising seas had already started, drowning what was left of Doggerland and erasing its communities in one violent stroke. It's a genuinely cinematic idea, a lost world, wiped from the map in an instant, taking its people down with it. Here's where the story gets more complicated, and honestly, more interesting, because when archaeologists went looking for direct evidence of that single catastrophic ending, what they found was messier than the dramatic version suggests. Recent research digging into sediment cores across the southern North Sea has found signs that some parts of the old Doggerland landscape may have recovered and persisted after the tsunami struck, rather than being permanently drowned in one blow. In several areas studied, researchers found that the wave's impact varied enormously depending on local geography, with some low-lying coastal zones absorbing a devastating hit, while other, more sheltered areas may have escaped anything close to complete destruction. Part of the problem, researchers point out, is that the very violence of the tsunami may have destroyed a lot of the evidence that would otherwise prove how destructive it truly was. A wave powerful enough to rearrange a coastline is also powerful enough to scour away campsites, tools, and remains that might have told us exactly what happened to the people living there, leaving behind gaps in the record that are just as easily read as absence of evidence as they are evidence of survival. Untangling those two possibilities, a community that vanished entirely and a community whose traces simply didn't survive to be found, has turned out to be one of the hardest parts of reconstructing this event at all. In other words, the traditional picture of a single wave instantly erasing an entire ancient world may be an oversimplification. The real Storegga event looks less like one clean, final blow, and more like a violent, uneven catastrophe, brutal in some places, survivable in others, that struck a landscape already slowly disappearing beneath the rising sea for other reasons entirely. So what did it actually feel like for the people who were there? We can't know with certainty, but we can look at what people who survived comparable disasters in comparable coastal communities remembered generations later. Indigenous oral traditions from the Pacific Northwest, describing tsunamis on the far side of the world from Doggerland, describe scenes of treetops tangled with debris, canoes flung deep into the forest, and rivers permanently rerouted by the force of the water. If the Storegga waves struck Mesolithic coastal camps with anything close to that violence, the survivors would have watched the geography they had known their entire lives get physically rearranged in a matter of minutes. Familiar shorelines gone, fishing grounds submerged, campsites and possibly people simply swept away. And then there was everything that came after for the ones who survived it. No emergency shelters, no aid arriving from anywhere. Just whatever dry, defensible ground was left, and whatever food, tools, and knowledge people could carry with them or dig back out of the wreckage. Coastal Mesolithic communities across this region had spent countless generations learning to read the sea, to work with its tides and its mood, to know exactly where to camp and where to fish depending on the season. That knowledge would have counted for very little against a wave with no precedent in living memory, a hazard nobody's grandparents had ever warned them about, because nothing like it had ever happened in a human lifetime before. What mattered instead was the same brutal calculus that runs through every disaster in human history. Who could move fast enough? Who had high ground nearby? Who had people around them willing to help them get there? Small differences in exactly where a family happened to be camped that particular week, upstream or down, on a hillside or a river flat, may have quietly decided who lived and who didn't. There is something almost eerie about how well this land is preserved today, precisely because it drowned instead of eroding away on dry land. Fishing trawlers working the North Sea have, for over a century, occasionally dragged up bones, tools, and even the remains of ancient forests from the seabed, fragments of a world that otherwise vanished from human memory entirely. Doggerland only exists to us now because the sea buried it rather than destroying it, sealing an entire vanished landscape under layers of mud and sand, waiting for cores and trawl nets to bring pieces of it back into the light thousands of years later. So let's put it all together and really see what your ancestors were up against and what they actually did about it. They faced a wave generated by one of the largest submarine landslides in the geological record, a wall of water striking coastlines with absolutely no warning in a world already slowly losing solid ground to rising seas. A disaster that should, by any reasonable measure, have simply erased every community it touched all at once without a trace, leaving nothing behind for anyone to ever find again. And instead, the more carefully we look, the more the story resists that simple ending. Some communities were almost certainly devastated in a single afternoon. Camps and family groups gone before anyone nearby even understood what had happened. Others, in more sheltered corners of the same drowning landscape, appear to have held on, adapted, and kept living on ground that hadn't yet gone under, rebuilding a version of the life they'd known on whatever solid earth remained. It wasn't one clean apocalypse. It was thousands of individual desperate outcomes, decided by geography, timing, and sheer luck, playing out across an entire coastline at once, on a single, ordinary-turned, catastrophic day that nobody there could have possibly seen coming. You will see a tsunami warning on your phone today, hours or even minutes before anything arrives, and have time to get to higher ground. They had a normal morning, ordinary in every way, right up until the sea itself became something no one there had ever imagined it could be. And the fact that any of that world survives at all, in trawled-up bones and buried forests and sediment cores, read carefully enough to argue with the simplest version of the story, is the only reason we know Doggerland and the people who called it home were ever there in the first place.